I had a good 4 years at Smith once I got over the Depression. I had a good, straight, solid classical education, majoring in English literature. I spent 4 years living with great writers. And that is how you learn to write. You learn to write from the great writers. They are the teachers. I started out by saying I'm not a Christian writer. I'll end by saying I'm not a children's writer. I write books. I write books for people. I write books for myself. I don't ever have an audience in mind. Now, I know it's popular for creative writing teachers to say that the writer must have the audience in mind at all times. I think that's disastrous. If you have the audience in mind, you don't have your story in mind. All you have in mind when you are writing is the book you are writing. And you're giving it everything you can possibly give it. I'm going to stop my autobiography here because it's time, but A Wrinkle in Time, when I finally wrote it, was basically my rebuttal to the German theologians. It's a very theological book, but I am a storyteller, and my job is, first of all, to write a good story to the best of my ability. And nobody told me that you write differently when you write for children. My first books were regular trade novels. 2 of my so-called young adult novels were originally published as regular trade novels. It's a terrible insult to children to write for children. If it isn't good enough for me, at my age, it's not good enough for any child. There is no difference in the techniques of fiction when you write for children and when you write for adults. I mean, they hold as true for Beatrix Potter as for Dostoevsky. I was at a Midwest University teaching a credit course, a brief credit course in techniques of fiction. About halfway through, a young woman came to me and said, I do hope you're going to teach us something about writing for children, because that's why I'm taking this course. And I said, well, what have I been teaching you? And she said, writing. I said, don't you write when you write for children? And she said, but isn't it different? I said, no, it's not different. The only difference is the age of the protagonist. I mean, most 12-year-olds are not going to want to read a book about a discontented 40-year-old. But other than that, there is no difference. I left college, and I went to New York to earn my living and to write. And I'll stop there, because I've talked for half an hour, which is what I plan to do, and hope that you will ask me some questions, because I'd like this to be more of a dialogue than a monologue.
You were talking about not being writers, being writers, and then you said later on that you can't feel it until you write it. What do you mean by that? I find that so fascinating.
That I can't heal it until I write it?
You can't feel it until you write it.
I can't heal it. Not feel, heal.
Yeah, well, what do you mean by that?
When something hurts me, when I'm wounded, it's inside me, and I often can't see it clearly. And when I write it out, even in the journal, it objectifies it for me. For instance, not long ago, somebody said something which hurt me really deeply, and I could not understand why this person could have said such a thing to me. And I wrote it all out in my journal in a great wail of self-pity. And when I had it out there, I saw that something I had said had caused the whole thing. It was my fault. And I wouldn't have realized it if I hadn't written it. Then I need to take the next step from the facts of whatever it is to the truth. And when my father died, I simply wrote in my journal, father died.
Is there a healing process then in your books that, like, I read your books and I find myself being healed from them too? Is that an intent, or is that just me thinking that?
It's not an intent. I mean, I decided to be writing when I was 5. You don't know that much when you're 5. It's something that I have come to realize after the writing of many, many books, that this is what happens. That I write it in my journal, I then put it into story, I then keep translating until I get at the truth of whatever it was. But I'm telling you this from hindsight, not from foresight. Thank you.
I always wondered what philosophy is, where you got that idea. Are they based on something that's really in my country?
What about mitochondria and farandoli and wind in the door? When I was writing this, I started a Wind in the Door, and I had all of the characters. I had Meg and Calvin and Charles Wallace and the parents, and the three horrible Mr. Jenkins, and Progo the cherubim, and Louise the Larger the snake, and Blageny the teacher, and I was blocked. I was stuck. I could not hear my story. And just at that point, my oldest and closest friend, who was a physician, sent me an article from the New England Journal of Medicine on mitochondria. And I read the article, and I thought, oh, I'm going to have to study cellular biology. So I went out and bought a couple of college textbooks on cellular biology. But I figured that by myself, I couldn't teach myself that much about mitochondria, so I invented farandoli. But my scientist friends tell me they're consistent with our present knowledge of particle physics.
You're partially responsible for me being able to take science courses leading
But you know, the marvel is, why did Pat send me that article at exactly that moment? And that happens over and over again. What I need gets sent to me just at the moment that I need it. And my only job is to recognize it. So it's a marvelous thing. Mitochondria. Mitochondria are subatomic particles. We are their host planet. They live within us. They need us to live. But they provide for us, we live in a completely symbiotic relationship with them. They provide for us the hydrogen transport line that gives us our energy. So if anything happened to our mitochondria, we would die from energy loss. And the scary thing is, I got a letter from a woman whose son was having problems with his mitochondria. It can happen.
Do you have any favorite authors that you enjoy reading yourself?
Do I have any favorite authors I enjoy reading? I have loads of favorite authors.
Elaborate a little bit?
I try to read Shakespeare and the 16th and 17th century writers fairly regularly because of their use of vocabulary and of language. We are becoming a vocabulary deprived country. And so to keep my vocabulary alive, I go to, also because they're marvelous. I read a lot of particle physics and quantum mechanics and astrophysics. This is my theology. These are the mystics of today. These are the people who are dealing with the nature of being. Right now I brought with me one of Ellis Peters' marvelous 12th century murder mysteries, set in England when Empress Maud and King Stephen were vying for the throne. They're all set in the Abbey at Shrewsbury, and Brother Cadfael as her detective, and they're theologically very sound, and she's literate. And they're wonderful books to read when you're tired. And don't want to have to work too hard, but don't want to be insulted either. So she's been in my bedtime reading. I like the Canadian writer, Robinson Davies, who is, I think, a splendid contemporary writer. I don't like books about anti-heroes. I don't like books about discontented women who keep dreaming up more and more things to be discontented about. When I read a book, I want to be stretched and enlarged and made to feel more rather than dwindled and made to feel less. I read a lot. Of course, one problem is that writing takes up a lot of time. The only time I get to read is when I go to bed at night. So I fall asleep.
Do you do pattern of like reading Bible, your favorite books?
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Do you daily pattern of reading things like the Bible? What's your favorite book of the Bible, and how do you instill that in the right?
I begin and end the day with morning and evening prayer and reading from both the Old and the New Testaments. And basically I simply go through them, because otherwise I would spend so much time on my favorite passages, I'd skimp other parts, which I know I'm meant to read. So I do read scripture, Old and New. We must not skip the Old, because the New Testament is so full of references to the Old Testament that we're supposed to recognize. And if we don't read it, we don't recognize them. And also the Old Testament has such wonderful characters. And if at any time I'm having an attack of unforgiveness, I'll read Jonah. And that'll put me back into a better proportion, better frame of mind. But it's important to me to do this because that makes the day God's day. And that what I do in it, therefore, is not related just to me, but to doing my best to follow God's purpose for me and for all of us. For me to write and to pray are almost the identical discipline because I have to let myself be got out of the way so I'm not in the way and I can listen. So I try when I pray to listen to God. I try when I write to listen to the book.
I was just wondering how you came about writing The Other Side of the Sun. I mean, what made you write that story? My favorite.
Which one?
The Other Side of the Sun.
Uh,
I love that one. I was just wondering why gave you the idea for that story.
well, my mother was a total Southerner who married a damn Yankee. And I would go every year to visit my Southern grandmother and my Southern cousins. And after the war, all anybody had was story. They had their stories. And so I grew up on these wonderful stories of my Southern kin. I knew when I wrote The Other Side of the Sun that I would have to write it from the point of view of an outsider, because I was always the Yankee outsider. But some of it is drawn from my own Southern family background. I have some marvelous female Southern forebears I don't ever want to let down. One of them, Susan Facio, who bewailed her lack of education and read French, Spanish, Latin, Greek, Italian, German, and knew philosophy and history. A terrible slave trader called Kingsley brought an African princess back and set her up on Fort George Island, which is off Jacksonville, Florida, where she was isolated, lonely, and nobody went to see her. I mean, of course, she was beyond the pale. So Susan Facio had herself rowed down the river once a week, spend the entire day with the princess, who was her closest friend, her only friend. Her daughter-in-law, the Madeleine L'Engle, after whom I'm named, also did what she thought was right, whether it was popular at that time or not. And so I have these wonderful women that I want to continue in their tradition. Don't want to let them down. And I know my mother was the oldest and had 4 brothers. My father was the youngest, had 8 or 9 sisters. So I know far more about my mother's stories because it was the Southerners who told stories. And so The Other Side of the Sun came out of my experience of the Southern half of me.
Can you tell us what you're working on now?
What I'm working on now? Well, a week ago Monday was publication date of 2-part invention, which is the 4th of the Crosswicks Journals, and it's subtitled The Story of a Marriage. And when I went to the party, I carried with me a new manuscript, which I gave to my editor, which is a fantasy, and so that's in. And I'm now working on the 3rd volume of the Genesis trilogy, Sold into Egypt, about Joseph, and working on a life of Christ based on the paintings of Giotto, which I've been asked to write. The paintings are absolutely wonderful. I mean, they're strong, virile paintings. Jesus is no wimp, and as he so often is made out to be. And so what I hope and pray to do is to prevent this marvelous, wild, wonderful man that he was, rather than the pallid, puny thing that so often. I've never seen a play or a movie where he was reasonably cast. Never seen an actor who could lift up a hammer. I mean, Jesus was a carpenter. He was strong. He was a man of incredible laughter and storms, and he lost his temper, and he was wonderful. He wasn't pale and pallid. So that's a very terrifying chore that I'm attempting.
There has always been, throughout years, a tension between art and faith, and often looking down upon art as being something that's sometimes even though the devil might think. And in my view,
the tension between art and faith. Well, that's one of the few advantages of having been born an Episcopalian. There isn't any tension. There never has been for me any tension between art and faith. Now, my husband was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, of a good Southern Baptist family, and that was a whole different kettle of fish. I did not really know anything about the evangelical world until I went to Wheaton. In fact, I didn't know it was an evangelical college till I got there. And I had prepared my talks on fantasy and fairy tale. I thought, oh, well, I'll be lynched, never mind. But I keep going back. I keep going back. As a matter of fact, Walking on Water came out of lectures at Wheaton. And they were just discovering that art is not sinful. This is a whole new idea to me. Art has always been for me an expression of faith. I speak for some obscure reason quite often in evangelical settings and at evangelical colleges. And almost always a young girl would come to me and say, how did your husband reconcile being a Christian with being an actor? And I would tell a small story. I would say that one time the play he was in was closing. There wasn't anything else in the offing. We had 3 kids in schools. And he came home from the theater one night with a play in which he